The birth of the Adeptus Mechanicus was an infamous period in the Imperium's history, one marked by civil war and a nearly catastrophic confrontation between Mechanicum refugees and the newly formed Council of Terra. This was an incredibly delicate moment, where one wrong move could have seen the Mechanicum, the Titan legions, and the military forces of Terra itself embroiled in a bloody civil war, all while the War Master's forces were on their way to overthrow the Emperor and crush his Imperium. But in order to truly understand how and why the Adeptus Mechanicus was created in the first place, how it officially became part of the Imperium, and all of the events leading up to the period now known as the Binary Succession, we have to go way back to the Imperium's earliest history. So here's the deal. During the Great Crusade, there was only the Mechanicum. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not exist yet. Now, after the Emperor had fully united Earth during the Unification Wars, he would end up journeying to Mars. It was to be the first planet inducted into the Emperor's new Imperium, and he would be successful, kind of sort of. The Martians saw him as the avatar of the Omnissiah, the machine god that they worshipped, a golden messiah figure that had been spoken about in prophecy for millennia. If you know anything about the Big E, you know that he's not cool with religion and was especially not a fan of himself being viewed as some kind of deity. However, he made a one-time exception for the Mechanicum, as if things went south and civil war between Terra and Mars started, it would have completely derailed his plans. He realized that he couldn't just show up on Mars, tell these people their faith was a lie, and join him or else. That kind of thing may end up working on backwater worlds with little to no major martial strength to speak of, but sacred Mars? That blasphemy would have been met with immediate, violent retaliation. So when it came to the treaty they signed, there were a lot of stipulations. First and foremost, the Mechanicum pressed for its continued independence. They would not officially be considered part of the Imperium, but would be its closest ally, the two empires coexisting with one another. This way, the Martians and all of their Forge worlds would be able to maintain a certain degree of autonomy and independence. The Emperor agreed to this, but in exchange, there would be severe limitations put in place on what they were and were not permitted to research or create, namely any form of artificial intelligence or devices that pried too deeply into the warp. All of this technology going forward was considered heretical. Any of these devices they currently had in their possession, as well as all of the libraries of information pertaining to such technology, were to be locked away deep under the planet's surface in an impenetrable vault that only the Emperor or a trusted representative would be able to access. These vaults were known as the Vaults of Moravec, and fun fact, were originally created by Primus Moravec, an individual who had sought to create artificial intelligence that surpassed humanity in every conceivable way. A person who ended up being branded as a witch for his transgressions. Now, here's the thing, not all members of the Mechanicum saw the Emperor as the avatar of the Omnissiah. In fact, a sizable portion, led by Fabricator General of Mars Calbor Hal, secretly harbored views that he was nothing more than a false idol. And seeing as he was no deity to them, his restrictions on what they could and could not research were viewed as a huge overstepping of the Emperor's power. And so in turn, the signing of the treaty, a great act of unity between Terra and Mars, so too planted the bitter seeds of resentment that would eventually grow into outright hatred. A little while later, at the onset of the Horus Heresy, the group that was secretly hostile towards Terra and would later be known as the Dark Mechanicum, was approached by the traitorous War Master Horus Lupercal. He offered them a deal, join his side and overthrow the Emperor, and in Horus's new kingdom, the Mechanicum would not only remain fully independent, but would have access to those vaults once again. In addition, they would be free to research any field of study they wished. There would be no limitations placed upon what they could create, and together, they would usher in a technological and mechanical revolution that reshaped the galaxy in their own image. The offer was accepted, and after their treachery was fully revealed, the Mechanicum Civil War, known as the Schism of Mars, would tear the Red Planet apart. Despite the valiant efforts of those still loyal to Terra and the Emperor, the battle for the Red Planet would inevitably be lost, and Mars would be completely taken over by the traitors. The surviving loyalists would end up fleeing to Terra as refugees. Now, the Imperium refused to acknowledge the traitorous Calbor Hal as Fabricator General of Mars, and thus one of his subordinates, Zagarius Kane, who was Forge Master of Mondus Oculum, and a key figure in the loyalist Martian resistance, would end up being named as the new Fabricator General. So this created a huge problem, as there was now two Mechanicums, one loyal to the Emperor and Terra, led by Kane, and the other loyal to Horus Lupercal and the traitors, led by Hal. Although Hal's authority was no longer recognized by Terra, he maintained control of the Red Planet, and Kane, although formally recognized by Terra as Fabricator General, was seemingly done so in name only, as he and his followers had been exiled from their homeworld. To say this was a dark period of mourning and uncertainty is a huge understatement. The soul of the Mechanicum was in torment. They had lost their sacred birth world, and everything they thought they had ever known had been thrown into absolute chaos. In all honesty, it would have been better if some xenospecies had taken over Mars, because then it would simply be a mission of taking it back. Instead, even if that was possible, the Mechanicum itself had been torn in half. The loyalist half saw the existence of two Fabricator Generals as an unacceptable and unresolved equation, one that would come to be known as the binary succession, one that if left unresolved would continue to generate chaotic code and eventually violent unrest. But before we get into all that, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. Being a YouTuber full-time is not the hardest job in the world, but it's definitely time-consuming. On average, I spend about 70 hours a week in my studio, doing everything from researching, scripting, editing, and whatever I need to make my videos. The unfortunate side effect of this is I just don't have time to cook like I used to. But thankfully, there's the amazing people over at today's sponsor, Factor, that make delicious, never-frozen, pre-prepped meals that ship directly to your door. Their meals are chef-crafted and dietitian-approved and ready in just 2 to 3 minutes. They save you time by cutting down on dishes, trips to the grocery store, and eliminating the need for greasy, bad-for-you fast food. And the best part is, they've got meals for every type of lifestyle. Whether you're vegan, vegetarian, following a keto or high-protein diet plan, they've got something for everyone. You'll have over 35 different options to choose from each week, and there's even more to enjoy with over 55 nutrition-packed add-ons that help make your weekly meal planning even more delicious. I like a wide variety of food, so I normally go with the chef's choice and try a little bit of everything. If you've got a special event coming up and need to change up your schedule or cancel a few meals, it's no problem. Factor is super flexible. Head on over to factor75.com or click on the link below and use code Weshammer50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and free wellness shots for life. 2 free wellness shots from 3 available flavors for every order while you're an active subscriber. Again, head on over to factor75.com or click on the link below and use code Weshammer50 to get 50% off your first Factor box, as well as free wellness shots for life. 2 from 3 available flavors for every order while you're an active subscriber. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video. The most important person in the story of the binary succession was an individual known as Ambassador Vetherel, a woman appointed by Kane himself to act as his representative, his political voice in this new tumultuous political landscape they found themselves in on Terra. Kane had chosen her specifically because not only was she an incredibly skilled diplomat and a loyal daughter of Mars who saw the beauty in both the machine and human elements of the Mechanicum, but importantly, she possessed very few actual augmetics, other than her red robes and a series of electrically charged tattoos under the surface of her skin known as electus that were not visible to the naked eye. She appeared fully human, indistinguishable from those who lived on Terra. This may not seem like that big of a deal, but her human face was an invaluable political tool that could be used to garner both support and sympathy for the plight of the Martians. Kane had looked human once before. In fact, only a few years back when she had first met him, he possessed very few augmetics like herself. However, ever since the Martian Schism, he had thrown himself into a never-ending barrage of augmetic enhancement. At this point, he fully resembled a machine. His legs had been replaced with tank tracks, he was surrounded by whirling, writhing mechadendrites, and the only human element left of him was his 2 human arms. Although the Mechanicum may have viewed his mechanical apotheosis as a beautiful blessing by the machine god, those on the Terran Council would view him as a monster. It was both Vetherel and Kane's belief that the Martian refugees and all members of the Mechanicum still loyal to Terra must be formed into a new Adeptus of the Imperium in order to legitimize Kane's standing as Fabricator General of Mars and thus end the binary succession. And quick side note, the term Adeptus is one that tends to confuse people. Like, what actually is an Adeptus? You can think of them like an official branch of the governmental body of the Imperium, a branch of imperial authority. The most apt real-world example would be like different departments of the federal government. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, the Navy, the Air Force, etc., etc. This is important because, again, the Mechanicum is not at this point part of the Imperium. It is simply its closest ally. By becoming an Adeptus, the Mechanicum and thus Mars would be sacrificing the freedom it was promised in the Olympian Accord. It would no longer simply be an ally of the Imperium, but would officially become part of it. However, in exchange for that freedom, as an official Adeptus, the priesthood would have an official voice in all matters concerning the future of the Imperium going forward. The binary succession would end, Martian unity would once again be achieved, and their loyalty would be cemented and no longer questioned. Vethril attempts to bring this proposal before the Council of Terra, a group helmed by officials from every major Adeptus of the Imperium. This ruling body was created by the Emperor of Mankind and was intended to replace the Imperial War Council after the triumph of Olenor. This was an institution that would eventually come to be replaced by the Senatorum Imperialis, or the Council of the High Lords of Terra as it is more commonly known. The lords of this council rejected the original proposal. They absolutely hated the idea. They viewed it as a thinly veiled power grab done by a group of people who could not be trusted after the events on Mars. Har Rantel, Grand Provost Marshal of the Adeptus Arbites, had this to say. "This is a power grab, and a clumsy one at that. You cannot maintain autonomy while claiming elevation through Adeptus. Or would you have a body on this council that is not answerable to it? A body of already questionable loyalty. You will not permit the rest of us to have reasonable doubts about the Mechanicum? Has Mars not had a civil war of its own? Is it not currently in the hands of traitors? Has none of its unrest traveled with the exiles to Terra? Your priesthood is at war with itself. Is your proposal really meant to inspire our confidence in it once more? And after the Adeptus Mechanicus, what is next? Will others seek the same status, giving the Fabricator General allies on the Council? Is this conquest by political means?" It's at this point that the master of the Adeptus Administratum, Simeon Pentasian, leans forward to voice his concerns. He viewed the proliferation of the Adepta as a ridiculous notion. With each new branch created, it lessened its overall strength. It lessened the very meaning of the word. He questioned whether or not her intent was to flood the council with voices until none of them could be heard and nothing would ever be accomplished. It's important to remember that at this exact moment in time, the formation of the Adeptus Arbites was a relatively new thing, one the Adeptus Terra had been against since the beginning. So the sudden creation of another Adeptus, this Adeptus Mechanicus, was unthinkable to them. In the ambassador's initial proposal, she stated that the appointment of the status of Adeptus would only be temporary, and after the War Master had been defeated, a different solution could be negotiated. But they weren't buying it. From their perspective, a temporary solution like this was only a thinly veiled attempt at making a more permanent institution more palatable. By the end of the session, the entire crowd has erupted with shouts of condemnation, shouted cries of hatred, many of them shouting at the ambassador and the tech priest in attendance to go back to Mars. However, there was one amongst the crowd that was intrigued by her proposal, the First Lord of Terra himself, Malkador the Sigillite. Shortly after the council had concluded, he sent her a message requesting a private meeting. When they finally stood face to face, he asked her if her and Kane knew what they were doing. She tells him that they did, and he tells her that he's currently weighing the possible consequences of both rejecting and accepting the creation of the Adeptus Mechanicus. She tells him point blank that she is convinced that not forming the Adeptus Mechanicus will lead to catastrophe. It is the only way of resolving the binary succession. The Mechanicum could not have two leaders. He tells her that even though she may not have achieved what she set out to this day, her words had put events into motion. He cautions her that although she may think little of the other lords, that they may have seemingly been acting out of their own selfish and petty interest, in their souls, they did have the best interest of the Imperium in mind. They called it a power grab, and from their perspective, that was a very real possibility. The creation of another Adeptus would greatly alter the balance of power on Terra. She warns Malkador that whether or not the Adeptus is created, the power of the Mechanicum existed, even in a divided state. There were many possible solutions to this binary succession, and many of them would end in bloodshed. The Council could not afford the wrong sort of Martian unity. Malkador tells her that there was power in what she unleashed that day, and they would all have to deal with the consequences. The future was uncertain, and hopefully, in the coming days, they would all end up making the correct decisions. He wished her well and then trudged away, his slender figure disappearing in the shadows between the columns. However, she stayed behind a little while longer in quiet contemplation. She was aware of how her and Kane's actions would be interpreted by the High Lords. Their rejection had not blindsided her. Ever more pressing, though, was how her actions would be interpreted by her brothers and sisters within the Mechanicum. That evening, she went to the Solar Vigil ramparts to gather with her people. And every night, the Martian refugees would gather here to witness their homeworld travel across the sky. It was a ceremony of mourning, of grief for their lost peers and for their sacred homeworld. There before her were hundreds of robed celebrants. She knew they would have questions and accusations, and she would do her best to answer them. But at the moment, everyone stood together in silent grief. The group watched in silence as Mars ascended in the sky, but when it finally disappeared from view, the silence was broken. Magos Garantor stepped forward and demanded to know what she had done. He pointed a finger at her, saying that she had undermined the Treaty of Olympus, she had disobeyed the word of the Omnissiah, and that her proposal to formalize the Adeptus Mechanicus was formalizing Terra's control of the priesthood, that she would see them all be slaves and their sacred homeworld forgotten. She denies his accusations. She's about to say that the proposal is only meant to be temporary, but before she can get the words out, she stops, knowing that no one would believe that. Instead, she tells them of the necessity of an Adeptus Mechanicus, that as it stood, the council only saw the priesthood as a bunch of refugees. If an Adeptus Mechanicus was formed, then they would be forced to listen to Martian concerns. She told him that she prays that he will see the necessity of this becoming a reality. She became acutely aware of the narrowing mechanical eyes upon her from every member of the crowd. Some may have been sympathetic to her cause, while others viewed her with outright hatred. The fact that she didn't look like them and lacked their sacred mechanical augmentations serving only as fuel for their suspicions. They believed her a traitor, one who had spoken against the Mechanicum and their sacred treaties. Garantor reached out and grabbed her robes, telling her once again that they would be slaves. Feeling defeated, she tells him that it's clear to her that nothing she says will convince him of the full expression of her devotion to the Omnissiah and the will of the Fabricator General of the Mechanicum. Believe otherwise if you will, she says, but the Adeptus Mechanicus must become a reality, and I will fight to see that it happens. She moved away and began to walk through the crowd, the tech priests parting to let her pass, murmurs of Gothic and binaric cant echoing all around her. She may have been done with the debate, but it was alive and burning throughout the crowd. Suddenly, she heard Garantor shout out no, and she turned back to look at him. He says that they will not let her dishonor the treaty. They could not let her crush the Mechanicum and the independence of Mars. It was then that she heard the whirring, buzzing of saws and mechanical limbs from behind her, and she turned to see another Magos charging her. She tried to duck out of the way, but the assassin's mechadendrites seized her by the arm. She might not have carried any weapons, but she wasn't helpless. She channeled the energy of her hidden Electus and released a massive charge of biomechanical electricity through her arm, overloading the mechadendrites and stunning the Magos that gripped her. She broke free and looked back. There was rapid movement all around her. Panic was surging throughout the crowd. Some began to move towards her aid, while others ran in shock and confusion. Garantor stood where he remained, bearing witness to the execution he had arranged. Emerging from the crowds were 3 electro-priests that rushed her. They had thrown back their robes in full combat fury, their faces twisted into masks of pure hatred. They had not come here to mourn, but to murder. She ducked under one of the attacks, but caught a glancing blow from another one's staff, the impact causing her to weaken as her life energy was drained. Her body became sluggish and her electros grew dark. She stumbled back into a crowd and they recoiled from her. Whatever their personal beliefs, they saw her death as a certainty, and they would not throw themselves needlessly into a conflict that had already been decided. If she was doomed to fall, then surely the Omnissiah had found her wanting, and her heresy was confirmed. She caught another blow in her ribs that caused her vision to grow dark and searing pain to shoot throughout her body. She fell to her knees and was barely able to lift her head, but she saw Garantor finally walking towards her. His expression held no emotion. He was a faithful servant, driven onward by what he saw as a grim duty.
Cain is not worthy to be our Fabricator General. In executing his puppet emissary, we reject his Terran-given authority. We act now for the salvation of the Martian priesthood.
Before he could say any more, a sudden violent las blast caught him in the head, scorching a searing trench through his skull. More las fire streaked above her, slamming into her attackers. She dragged herself forward as the rest of the crowd began to flee in terror. There were other assassins in the crowd that were attempting to come to the aid of the first wave, but they suddenly found themselves embattled with a new threat. One that didn't come from loyal Mechanicum protectors, but the uniformed officers of the Collegia Titanica. There were 12 in total, 4 princeps, each flanked by 2 Moriarty, each wielding a las carbine. In the resulting chaos, the Magos assassin from before saw an opening and lunged at her again, the assassin's mechadendrites wrapping around her arms and neck and began to choke the life from her. Suddenly, a shrieking screech of mechanical pain erupted from its throat as plasma fire slammed into its back, causing it to melt in on itself in a heap of smoldering metal. She got to her feet once more and found herself face to face with a man and a woman, a male princeps named Basanius and a female named Tethera. Her soul felt drained, and she wept for the violence that had unfolded. Martians had once again turned on each other. The tech priest that lay dead before her believed in the righteousness of their actions. Now, even the faithful had turned upon each other. This had to stop. Whimpering, she tells the princeps that she was in their debt, and so was Mars. They tell her that there was no debt between them. They did what had to be done, just as she had in the council chamber. She looked around at the bodies that laid before her, at the consequences of her decisions. She turned back to the princeps and asked them if that meant they agreed with her proposal. They told her that they did, and even though her proposal risked the independence of Mars, in retrospect, that didn't really matter if there was no Imperium left to speak of. They tell her to bring her proposal before the council again, that this time they would ensure that it passed. She now had the leverage that she lacked before. She thinks about what the princeps are telling her, and she asks if they truly understand how far they may have to go, if they understand the lines that may have to be crossed in order to secure Mars's future. They tell her that they do, and although they are all in agreement, deep in her heart, she suspected that there was nothing good about what they were about to do. A few days later, the second session of the council began, although this time, all of the princeps of the Collegia Titanica members on Terra were in attendance, with one notable exception. One of the princeps from before, Basanius, had a much more important task to attend to. The High Lords of the other Adepta filed in and took their seats, and the session began. Hal Rantel once again made the opening remarks. At first, he condemned the attempt on the ambassador's life as a cowardly and despicable act, but followed up that statement with the point that such an attack was clear evidence of the Martian refugees' continued infighting, that they had brought their conflict not only to Terra, but the Imperial Palace as well. The High Lords echoed his resentment, and it was clear to the ambassador that their minds had already been made up. Their attitude from the previous session had followed them into this one. However, there's one major difference between this session and the last one. The ambassador's tone has completely changed. She's no longer simply pleading to them to see reason in her request. There's a new air of confidence about her, and she tells them that if they truly believe the war is only a Martian one, then their ignorance was the true danger to Terra, something that causes a ripple of amusement to roll throughout the crowd. Simeon Pentasian got from his seat and stated that this bickering was simply a distraction. The only thing that mattered here was the disposition of the Collegia Titanica. Vethril fired back. And who will decide that? The Honorable High Lords of Terra? By what right and under what authority? Under the provision of the Treaty of Olympus, the Titan legions have never acted under orders from this council, but voluntarily acceded to its many requests. If the Council of Terra will not give Mars the right to decide its own destiny, how long do you think Terra can stand against the War Master without the Mechanicum's assistance? And how long will you be allowed to behave as if you control the mighty Titans yourselves? Your implied threats do your cause no good. Furthermore, they ignore the reality of our situation. Mars has no voice here because Mars belongs to the traitors. Once more, we are losing ourselves in recriminations and insults rather than acting for the good of the Imperium. There is one point upon which I will agree with Ambassador Vethril. The current situation regarding the chain of command is not tenable. Surely you do not seek to endorse the creation of their new Adeptus? Absolutely not. Given that Mars is currently lost to us, I believe we must all accept the fact that the treaty signed between Terra and the Mechanicum cannot be held valid. All of its provisions are nullified. We must act to formalize a new accord and essential authority. Yes, the Collegia Titanica needs a clear chain of command, and the chain should begin here and the Council of Terra. That was it. She had heard enough. This was her last effort to reason with the council, and it was apparent that her efforts were pointless. The High Lords were lining up to pick over the carcass of the Mechanicum before it had even died. She looked at Tethera, and they both nodded. It was time. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the massive doors of the chamber were flung open. There, in the entryway, stood Zagreus Kane. He rolled forward on mechanical treads across the marble floor and entered the political arena. He came bearing no weapons, as was the law, but he was a living embodiment of the perfection of the machine. His very existence was a threat, and the ambassador saw clearly now why he had not chosen to come here until now. His mere presence precipitated crisis. The Collegia Titanica representatives throughout the chamber stood as one, signifying their unity with the Fabricator General. A jolt of realization spread throughout the crowd, hitting the High Lords with particular force. They were suddenly aware that there was a concentrated military force in the middle of their council, one that, although unarmed, was no less intimidating. At the head of the debating table, Malkador the Sigillite rose to his feet, planting his staff firmly on the floor. He called out to the Fabricator General and told him to think very carefully about their next actions. The ambassador and Tethra moved to stand beside the Fabricator General. Tethra turned to address the tiers of the chamber above them.
I am Warmonger Princeps Tethra of the Legio Agravides. We have come to be heard, so hear our voices now and take heed. If the formation of the Adeptus Mechanicus is not approved in this session, then the Collegia Titanica will know where it stands, and we will no longer be the puppets of the Council of Terra. To your eternal shame, you have abandoned sacred Mars, homeworld of my Legio. Now you demand my comrades forsake their worlds too, to burn undefended beneath the assaults of the traitors. If there is no Adeptus for Mars, there will be no Titans for the throne world. We will abandon the solar war and return to our own fiefdoms immediately.
The chamber erupted in roars of outrage and condemnation. Council members and observers alike shouted over each other, the noise washing over the ambassador, Tethra, and Kane as they stood there in silence, unmoving rocks in a sea of anger. Har-Rentel jumped to his feet and pointed an accusing finger at the ambassador, shouting that this was who she truly was. This was treachery. It was a coup, and he would see her executed for this. This is no coup. This is a resolution of an equation. We understand the necessity of an Adeptus Mechanicus. If you do not, then you must be shown it in terms you can comprehend. The binary succession must be ended.
I tire of this.
He turned to his fellow High Lords.
Let me call in the Arbites. I will have the Martians arrested and tried for their crimes against the throne.
The uproar continued to grow louder, some members shouting condemnations while others urged caution and time to consider what was happening here. A massive line in the sand was about to be crossed, one there would be no turning back from. The leaders of both the loyalist portion of the Mechanicum and the members of the Collegia Titanica in chains would be a political disaster that would have widespread implications across the galaxy. Finally, some of them were beginning to see the danger they were in, but unfortunately, it was not enough, and there was no time left. A deep reverberating impact shook the chamber. The ambassador and the Titan officers noted it well, but didn't even flinch. Another impact, stronger this time, one that caused the walls of the chamber themselves to shudder and the lumens to flicker. The council delegates and the High Lords looked at each other in confusion, even as a third tremor shook the foundation upon which they sat. Only Malkador the Sigillite stood unflinching. It was then that Mars's greatest voice on Terra was heard, as the war horn of an Emperor-class Titan bellowed out in the distance, causing all who heard it to immediately fall silent. Its roar was deep and piercing, and caused masonry dust to fall from the ceiling. Another reverberating footfall echoed out, this one stronger and apparently closer. The master of the Administratum's eyes grew wide with fear, and he demanded the ambassador explain what was happening. The Imperator Magnificum Incendius of the Legio Ignatum walks towards us. Although her words were a simple statement of fact, their implications were enormous. The High Lord stared at her in horror as another blare of the war horn was unleashed, much louder and closer than before. The chamber remained silent, thousands holding their breath at once, listening to the approach of the God Machine. One of the most enormous and powerful war machines ever constructed by human hands was marching with ominous purpose towards the heart of political power on Terra. It had stepped over the defenses created to protect the master of mankind as if they were not there, and now strode down the wide avenues of the outer palace, driving crowds of fleeing citizens before it. Its huge weapon arms cycled up, rotary barrels the size of maglev trains, and plasma accelerators that could drive a starship. The Titan's roar was so loud, it seemed like that alone could bring the palace tumbling down. Although the custodian guard tried to flank it, and emplacement guns were brought awkwardly to bear, having only been intended to fire outwards from the walls, they would ultimately prove useless. There was nothing within 100 kilometers that could challenge the Titan in terms of raw, destructive power. Even though there were no windows so nobody could see what was coming, the sound was enough. Panic spread throughout the council chamber. Everyone present knew of the Holocaust an Emperor-class Titan could unleash. Its voice was a howl to shatter the heavens. The end was coming, and there would be no escape and no recourse.
"Stop this! You are commanded to stop!"
shouted Pentasian. The ambassador stood her ground.
"Who commands us?"
Her words timed to come between the beats of the war horn.
"Who commands the Mechanicum? Who commands the Titans? The binary succession is the product of poor Martian logic and frightful Terran ignorance, and it may prove the doom of us all."
Her gaze shifted from the frightened lords over to Malkador. He was watching her steadily, his face shadowed and expressionless. He said nothing. He was letting the situation play itself out. She wondered if he was so confident that there were lines that her and the Collegia Titanica wouldn't cross, or if said lines had already been left far behind. The ambassador and the princeps had committed themselves fully. The consequences of this day would be unavoidable. She could feel the sigillite judging her, waiting to see if once and for all, she was prepared for what she had set in motion. Or maybe, she thought, maybe he wanted this too. The panicked members of the chamber scrambled over each other, attempting to flee, but there would be no escape. As another thunderous footfall could be heard, the ambassador spoke again.
"The binary succession must be resolved. The Adeptus Mechanicus is the resolution. There can only be 0 or 1. It cannot be both. Otherwise, there is uncertainty. With uncertainty, can there ever truly be loyalty? And if there is no loyalty..."
The Titan's battle cry came again. One more step and it would crush the dome beneath its immense armored foot. Har Renthal threw up his hands.
"Enough!"
He stumbled back to the table and sunk down into his chair.
"Enough."
The other lords, some of them halfway to the chamber's exit, looked shrunken and small. They turned and nodded their agreement. The ambassador nodded to Tethra, who spoke into her vox feed, telling Princeps Bethanius to stand down. The Titan halted, and the tremors suddenly ceased. His face sunken and ashen, the master of the Administratum gathered the courage to speak.
"We concur with Ambassador Vethriel. Yes, there will be an Adeptus Mechanicus to resolve the specific conflicts of succession within the Martian contingent on Terra."
Having not said a word throughout the entire thing, Malkador finally turned to the ambassador and spoke, his tone hard and unbowed.
"And what does the Mechanicum propose in return? Tell me, Ambassador, do you expect the Council to be held hostage indefinitely? The Adeptus Mechanicus will be a voice on the Council, but it cannot be the only voice."
Rantel added to Malkador's words, stating that this can never be allowed to happen again.
"There will be conditions. If Fabricator General Zagreus Kane is to ascend to the Council of High Lords, he must permit us some concessions as a gesture of good faith. But we will discuss such things only when the officers of the Titan Legions remove themselves from this chamber."
This was the price that had to be paid. Kane had to restore trust, and the ambassador's boldness had ensured that the price of that trust would likely be high. Ambassador Vethriel met outside with Basanius and Tethra. They stood at the foot of the Titan, who had halted its march nearly 100 yards from the council chamber, its banners flapping high in the winds. All of the citizens in the area gave the massive sentinel a wide berth, as those who had been in the chamber funneled out, staring up in awe at the subject of their recent terror. The princeps asked her if she achieved everything that she had hoped for, and she tells them that she had. The Adeptus Mechanicus was becoming a reality, but so too was the Adeptus Titanicus, that Mars had been promised to them once more in exchange for their full-hearted compliance and the defense of Terra in the battle to come. Tethra reminds her that the Titan Legion still had no true voice of its own. They would simply be enthralled to Zagreus Kane and the alliances he formed for his own purposes. But the ambassador tells her that that wasn't true, that he would honor all of the ancient oaths between the loyal commanders of the God Machines and the Martian priesthood, that he would insist upon Terra's recognition of this oldest of alliances, that they may now be bound to defend Segmentum Solar against the armies of the War Master, but the nature of their deployment would be under the authority of the Fabricator General. The Lesser Forge Worlds would not remain undefended. They would be fortified and protected by the Adeptus Mechanicus as the Titans march to war.
But what of the Treaty of Olympus? Is it now truly dead?
The treaty remains in place, even if Mars itself does not observe it. I have faith in the Omnissiah that we loyal few will take back the Red Planet when the time is right. For now, though, the home of the Adeptus Mechanicus is on Terra.
But what does that mean for us?
It means that the chain of command and the conduct of this war will have a clear order. Neither Mechanicus nor Titanicus can shape the Council's decisions and then ignore them whenever they choose. The decisions we will help to inform are also the ones by which we must abide. It is not a perfect outcome, but I believe it is the best that could be obtained. The two princeps exchanged a look, and Tethra turned back to the ambassador.
So this is our victory.
Victory against whom? There will be no victory until Horus is defeated. She thought about what had already been lost, what had already been destroyed. I don't think the Imperium will ever have a triumphant victory again. Those days are behind us.
So we gain influence and lose our autonomy. And for what?
The gain is greater than the loss. I do believe this. The binary succession is ended. There is only the Adeptus Mechanicus now, not temporary, but permanent. There shall only ever be one Fabricator General, and all loyal children of Mars who would hold true to their faith must follow his command for the good of all mankind. She looked up at the Titan, who had halted only a step or two from catastrophe. Just as when the assassins had come for her before, she had been one unlucky blow away from failure. The way forward was narrowed and shadowed, but they were all embarked upon it now. There was now only one path, and it led directly through the furnace of war.